A warm welcome to you all to this bite-sized learning, Accelerating Business Action on Governance. My name is Christina Koulias and I'm the Senior Manager of Global Governance here at the UN Global Compact in New York. I'd love to say a special thank you to my dear colleagues at the Global Compact Network Australia for this opportunity to be with you for this session. Before we kick things off, I just want to take you through what I hope you'll learn today, and that is that governance is more than you think. We'll go through the what, which is expanding the G in ESG through transformational governance, and I'll explain what that is in a bit more detail. The why, the road to transformational governance through rising societal expectations, and the how, taking action through the SDG 16 business framework, inspiring transformational governance, which is a microsite that we released earlier this year, and I'll take you through that as well. So kicking off with the what. So what you'll see here in front of you is the explanation of what we deem transformational governance. And as we currently face the greatest crises of our lifetime, there has been a striking realisation that the way we govern our institutions, both public and private, isn't working. This requires us to challenge our conventional wisdom and expand our view of the G in ESG. Transformational governance is a principles-based philosophy, not a new legal concept, that calls on businesses to embrace a systems approach to governance. This includes fostering a culture of accountability, integrity, and transparency that asks not only what is legal, but what is right. Businesses can accelerate action on governance through these three interrelated dimensions, and I'll go through those in turn. The first being conventional governance, which is traditionally understood to refer to corporate governance, including the accountability of company management to boards, and in turn, the accountability of overall company to shareholders bound by law and disclosure. Broadening the traditional notion of corporate governance maintains this importance of board and management oversight, but it also includes the values, the strategies, the policies, operations, and relationships of the organisation. We're seeing an increasing pressure on boards to consider the needs of other stakeholders as part of their fiduciary duties. The second circle you see there is on sustainable governance, and this refers to the effective management of environmental, social, and governance or ESG related risks and opportunities. And over recent years, we have all witnessed a rapid expansion of directives, frameworks, and legislation across various jurisdictions with respect to ESG disclosures, mandatory environmental and human rights due diligence, and stronger corruption, modern slavery, and sanctions legislation. Inevitably, with this rise in ESG regulation will be the rise in responsibility of corporate boards and executive management, with various shareholders calling for greater accountability and transparency in addressing ESG issues. The third and final is on global governance. And while conventional and sustainable governance reflect the rising expectations and scrutiny being placed on businesses, global governance inspires businesses to contribute responsibly as a complement, not a substitute for government action, in strengthening public institutions, laws, and systems at the international, national, and local levels. This relates to procedural and substantive aspects of how we are governed as a society, including how resilient we are in responding to and recovering from economic, political, environmental, and social shocks. Very much what we're experiencing today. Together, these three dimensions of governance reflect transformational governance as we describe it, and in essence is an expansion of the G in ESG. Now, it's worth noting here that many of these aspects of governance are often managed by different functions within a company. For instance, corporate governance is managed by company secretaries, chief financial officers, chief legal officers. Sustainable governance would typically be public relations or reporting and sustainability specialists. And global governance is typically seen or there's oversight by government relations and or legal departments. And many of these roles are increasingly overlapping. So in order to embrace transformational governance, this must be embedded across all functions and into the corporate DNA at all levels. So from the boardroom to the showroom. Now turning to the why. So as you can see by many of the headlines in front of you, what we've witnessed over the last few years, particularly last year, is a convergence of crises globally and locally. The COVID-19 pandemic, climate crisis, racial injustice, social inequality, the rise in disinformation and the erosion of democracy have shown that businesses do not operate independently of wider society. And businesses are increasingly being called upon by consumers, employees, investors, regulators, and society to speak up and to take action on environmental, political, and societal issues. The question is no longer if responsible businesses should engage, but how they should do so. And to be sure, this isn't an easy road to navigate. It's fraught with bumps and ditches. But this moment is calling for courageous leadership in addressing these crises. Businesses can and must play an important role in promoting ethical leadership and building trust between public and private institutions and trust in these institutions by civil society. Despite these expectations, it's important to stress that business cannot replace the role of government in ensuring that we live in inclusive, just and peaceful societies. And for further context, it would be remiss of me not to mention that the rise of corporate purpose and stakeholder capitalism are further compelling businesses to meet these rising expectations and challenges. It's these twin agendas have been gaining traction and appear to be accelerating due to these crises. The question now is whether these rising expectations will be met by business and how they will meet them. We found that the answer lies in part in the growing interest in and relevance of SDG 16 to businesses. In the lead up to the 75th session of the UN General Assembly last year, the UN Global Compact conducted interviews with 60 business leaders focused specifically on whether businesses should demonstrate greater leadership on SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Our interviewees confirmed the following, including that Goal 16 is a call for more accountable, inclusive and transparent institutions, public and private, that businesses should adopt a broader approach to the G in ESG to ensure that they not only have their own house in order, but they also support strengthening efforts towards institutions, laws and systems, that governments and businesses can no longer act alone. The time for leaders to demonstrate their commitment to and support for renewed global cooperation and inclusive multilateralism is now. And that finally, the UN Global Compact is the necessary medium through which these messages should be conveyed, and that SDG 16, or what we also term as transformational governance, should be a priority for the Global Compact. And I'm actually quite pleased to announce that transformational governance is confirmed as a priority area for our 2021 to 2023 strategy. But as you can see by the statement in front of you, these interviews culminated in a call from business leaders for renewed global cooperation. The statement acknowledges the foundational nature of SDG 16 in overcoming the greatest challenges of our time. And it highlights that both public and private institutions must do their part. Through a concerted campaign, the UN Global Compact secured over 1,300 CEO signatures from over 100 countries around the world in support of the statement, which was presented to the UN Secretary General on the margins of UN 75, as I mentioned last year. The statement created the legitimacy and the urgency needed to develop the SDG 16 business framework so that we can work together in turning this promise into practice. So now turning to the how. But before we get started on that, you might be wondering what SDG 16 is. So of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions, is arguably the least understood by business, but the most consequential to business. Responsible businesses want to operate and serve in communities where there are institutions, laws and systems that protect their rights and the rights of the individuals they employ and serve. At the same time, they recognise the need for their own values, strategies, policies, operations and relationships to be of a standard that ensures respect for people, for planet and for prosperity for all. By achieving the targets of Goal 16, we're able to foster more sustainable, inclusive and stable societies and deliver on the 2030 agenda, which is also known as the SDGs. At first glance, when you look at all the list of targets under Goal 16, it might appear as though they are only relevant to governments. But the SDG 16 business framework demonstrates that businesses can and must do their part. And you might notice that many of the targets under Goal 16 are actually quite consistent with many of the headlines that I showed you earlier. And so while the framework goes into far greater detail on how each target is relevant to business, both internally and externally, I'm going to speak generally under the themes of peace, justice and institutions, just for convenience. So the first theme of peace is covered by targets 1 on violence and 2 on children, which refers to the need for businesses to operate in environments that are free of violent conflict and for businesses to ensure that their actions do not cause or contribute to fueling violent conflict. These targets highlight how businesses can ensure they are providing safe environments for employees and communities and mitigating the risk of child exploitation in their operations and supply chains. The second theme is justice, and this is covered by targets 3, access to justice and the rule of law, 4, illicit financial flows, organised crime, and that includes human trafficking, 5, bribery and corruption, 9, legal identity, and 10, access to information and protection of fundamental freedoms. At the heart of these targets is the notion of businesses ensuring that they are being accountable and ethical in their own practices and being supportive of the shared space, which comprises journalists and environmental and human rights defenders and unions and others who often serve as critical sources in identifying corruption, disinformation, and rights violations. The final area is institutions, and this is covered generally by targets 6 and 7, which refer to ensuring that institutions, public and private, are effective, accountable, and transparent, and that these institutions adopt a responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative approach to decision-making at all levels. For businesses, this is highly relevant in terms of board composition, DE&I programs, ethics and compliance programs, including grievance mechanisms and whistleblower protections. And equally relevant in terms of how accountable, inclusive, representative and transparent governments are with respect to aspects of procedure, such as electoral processes, and policy aspects, such as climate change, with both being underpinned by universal principles and values. So as I mentioned, this is just a brief overview of how these targets are relevant to business. And I really do encourage you to take a closer look at the SDG 16 framework, which I'm going to give you a bit of a taste of in the next few slides, and of course show you the link at the end. So as the name implies, the framework is actually a translation of the targets under Goal 16 for business as it relates to their internal and external activities. It's a tool for businesses, developed by businesses, to inspire transformational governance, which is what we discussed earlier, and of course is encouraging this expanded G in ESG. And as I mentioned earlier as well, it doesn't seek to create new commitments or obligations, but rather builds on existing conventions and frameworks for responsible business conduct, including the UN Global Compact's 10 principles and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, among others. The framework aims to accelerate business action on the G in ESG by providing businesses with guidance on strengthening business culture, ethics, and performance, and supporting public institutions, laws, and systems. It's developed as a dedicated microsite, as you can see on this slide, and the framework presents the what, the why, and the how of transformational governance as underpinned by each of the targets under Goal 16. These next few slides will give you a better sense of what's in the framework as well. So the purpose of the framework is really to help deepen business understanding of the targets under Goal 16, and that includes a detailed explanation of each target and providing examples of how businesses are actually already taking action against those targets. We also hope that it strengthens cross-functional engagement right across the targets. And again, I mentioned that in my explanation of transformational governance earlier. It encourages businesses to assess where they are on the transformational governance journey and to identify opportunities for collaboration and improvements. It also encourages a greater incorporation into board and management oversight, the values and culture, strategies and policies, operations and relationships. So again, referring to the corporate DNA. And ultimately, we hope that it helps to inform governments, the multilateral system, investors and civil society on how to better engage with responsible businesses in accelerating transformational governance. And some here just to provide you some concrete examples or actions, the type of actions rather that business can take to advance SDG 16. As I mentioned, we tried to ensure that we looked at both the internal and external dimensions of those actions. And so just looking at the internal actions, you know, the most obvious being having the right culture and the right values in the organisation, making sure that we have the tone from the top, from the board, and making sure they're asking the right questions of management. What kind of committees do we have in place, and management oversight to ensure that we are embracing transformational governance? How is that supported by the right education, the right employment practices and training to ensure that it is embodied right throughout the organisation and that everyone can own transformational governance? Naturally, this would also need to be supported by having concrete policies and processes to support that endeavour, including having robust ethics and compliance programs, and as I mentioned earlier, having protection against retaliation. Making sure that we have the appropriate contract provisions when we're dealing with third parties, conducting robust due diligence and having grievance mechanisms in place. And overall having really good, robust risk management or enterprise risk management, and looking at what reporting, monitoring and controls that we have in place to ensure that. And then looking externally, how are we engaging with stakeholders? What is it we're doing when we're advancing our policy positions, and how are we advocating and lobbying in a way that is consistent with the tenets of transformational governance? How are we partnering with governments and civil society in capacity building and collective action, and also supporting government more deliberately in how they are monitoring and reporting on improving in these areas? And I think what's really important about that is that a lot of these issues are very sensitive. And so it's important that we have these collective voices. And of course, the vehicle that is the Global Compact to be able to facilitate that as well. And what's really important as well is that these are reinforced by concrete examples that are provided throughout the framework, and they are relevant across the 10 principles, the UNGPs and the SDGs as well, just to give you a bit more context. So I know that I've shared a lot of information with you today, but as you reflect on how your company can begin its journey towards transformational governance, I invite you to consider how you would reflect on these 3 questions. So, who should be in the room to ensure your business is embracing transformational governance at all levels of the organisation? How can businesses build trust and manage expectations and support the civic space? And what can you do to promote an expanded approach to the G in ESG that strengthens conventional, sustainable and global governance, or what we also refer to as transformational governance? So as you reflect on all of that, we really hope that you got a lot of value from the presentation in this session. This is the first of many presentations that we'll be delivering on transformational governance. So we warmly welcome any feedback that you may have for us to make this more valuable for you all. I also invite you to explore the SDG 16 business framework that I've mentioned just a few times throughout this session. And I hope you'll join us at the global level and also at the local level through our Global Compact Network Australia colleagues to mobilise businesses in accelerating action on governance as part of our organisational strategy. So please do feel free to contact myself and also my colleague Michelle Breslauer. And I really do hope that we hear from you soon. Thanks so much for your attention, and we really do look forward to connecting with you all soon. Thanks again, and bye for now.